In just 72 hours, 19 migrant children vanished from state-run buses in Texas. No records, no witnesses, no explanations, just names erased from paper, as if they never existed. And when Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett entered that silent courtroom to demand answers, she wasn't armed with outrage. She was armed with truth. What she uncovered didn't just shake the room, it shattered the illusion that power always protects. This is not the story the headlines told you. This is what happens behind sealed folders, redacted budgets, and backroom deals. And while the characters in this account are drawn from public life, the events have been fictionalized for the purpose of emotional exploration and social reflection. Because while the details may be imagined, the injustice, the fear, and the courage, they're painfully real. So ask yourself, if the system can make children disappear, what else is it hiding from you? Let's begin. It started with a message that wasn't supposed to be read. No subject line, no sender, just one line in the body of the email. Thursday, Room 6B, Oversight Subcommittee. Attendance expected. Jasmine Crockett blinked at the screen. No letterhead, no seal, no briefing attached. And yet, it wasn't spam. The language was too deliberate, too cold. It didn't ask. It didn't warn. It summoned. She forwarded the message to Marcus, her chief of staff, without saying a word. His response came less than a minute later, even though it was nearly midnight. There's no scheduled hearing on Thursday. That room hasn't been used in weeks. Jasmine stared at the line of text. Her finger hovered over the delete button, but she didn't press it. The next morning, security was unusually tight at the Capitol. She noticed it right away. 2 additional guards at the east entrance. Cameras that usually blinked idly were now frozen, recording. As she passed the rotunda, one of the Senate interns looked up from her desk a beat too long. Not suspicion, recognition, or maybe something close to warning. When Thursday came, Jasmine arrived without fanfare. No press, no staffers, not even her usual assistant. She wore navy blue, calm, unbothered, unreadable, the kind of color that said, "I didn't come to argue. I came to finish what someone else tried to hide." The hallway leading to room 6B felt colder than the rest of the building. Not in temperature, no. In energy. The way old churches felt when they'd buried too many truths. She walked past 3 closed doors before reaching the one with a faded bronze plate. 6B, Subcommittee Room. It was supposed to be used only for budget hearings. Nothing sensitive, nothing political. But when Jasmine pushed open the door, the air changed. Inside were 6 people. No introductions, no folders. Just a long wooden table with 1 empty seat. The others looked up, then back down, as if her presence wasn't a surprise. One of them she recognized, a senior analyst from the Office of the Inspector General. The others? Unknowns, suits without faces. Except one, an older woman with a medical ID badge barely concealed under her coat. Her eyes met Jasmine's for a moment too long, then dropped again. Something wasn't right. On the far end of the table sat a man whose presence didn't belong in a room like this. Governor Greg Abbott. Jasmine froze just for a second. His wheelchair was turned ever so slightly toward the exit, as if he too had walked into something unexpected. But he smiled. Not the smile of courtesy, the smile of someone who had already read the last page of a book you just started. "Congresswoman Crockett," he said, voice measured, smooth. "Glad you could make it. We were just getting started." No one offered her an agenda. No one explained why she had been called. She took the only empty seat, scanning the room for clues. No notepads, no recording equipment, just water glasses untouched. On the wall behind Abbott, a digital clock ticked down from 58:32, 58:31, like it was counting something. Time, silence, or consent. She folded her hands calmly. "Before we begin," she said slowly, "I'd like to know who sent the message that brought me here." Abbott's smile didn't fade. "You'll know, Jasmine," he said, almost whispering, "when you hear what they didn't want you to hear." A low click echoed from a speaker overhead, and then the tape began to play. It started with a message that wasn't supposed to be read. No subject line, no sender. Just one line in the body of the email. Thursday, Room 6B, Oversight Subcommittee. Attendance expected. Jasmine Crockett blinked at the screen. No letterhead, no seal, no briefing attached. And yet, it wasn't spam. The language was too deliberate, too cold. It didn't ask, it didn't warn, it summoned. She forwarded the message to Marcus, her chief of staff, without saying a word. His response came less than a minute later, even though it was nearly midnight. There's no scheduled hearing on Thursday. That room hasn't been used in weeks. Jasmine stared at the line of text. Her finger hovered over the delete button, but she didn't press it. The next morning, security was unusually tight at the Capitol. She noticed it right away. 2 additional guards at the east entrance. Cameras that usually blinked idly were now frozen, recording. As she passed the rotunda, one of the Senate interns looked up from her desk a beat too long. Not suspicion, recognition, or maybe something close to warning. When Thursday came, Jasmine arrived without fanfare. No press, no staffers, not even her usual assistant. She wore navy blue, calm, unbothered, unreadable. The kind of color that said, "I didn't come to argue. I came to finish what someone else tried to hide." The hallway leading to room 6B felt colder than the rest of the building. Not in temperature, no, in energy. The way old churches felt when they'd buried too many truths. She walked past 3 closed doors before reaching the one with a faded bronze plate, 6B, subcommittee room. It was supposed to be used only for budget hearings. Nothing sensitive, nothing political. But when Jasmine pushed open the door, the air changed. Inside were 6 people. No introductions, no folders, just a long wooden table with 1 empty seat. The others looked up, then back down, as if her presence wasn't a surprise. One of them she recognized, a senior analyst from the Office of the Inspector General. The others? Unknowns, suits without faces, except one, an older woman with a medical ID badge barely concealed under her coat. Her eyes met Jasmine's for a moment too long, then dropped again. Something wasn't right. On the far end of the table sat a man whose presence didn't belong in a room like this. Governor Greg Abbott. Jasmine froze just for a second. His wheelchair was turned ever so slightly toward the exit, as if he too had walked into something unexpected. But he smiled. Not the smile of courtesy, the smile of someone who had already read the last page of a book you just started. "Congresswoman Crockett," he said, voice measured, smooth. "Glad you could make it. We were just getting started." No one offered her an agenda. No one explained why she had been called. She took the only empty seat, scanning the room for clues. No notepads, no recording equipment, just water glasses untouched. On the wall behind Abbott, a digital clock ticked down from 58:32, 58:31, like it was counting something. Time, silence, or consent. She folded her hands calmly. "Before we begin," she said slowly, "I'd like to know who sent the message that brought me here." Abbott's smile didn't fade. "You'll know, Jasmine," he said, almost whispering, "when you hear what they didn't want you to hear." A low click echoed from a speaker overhead, and then the tape began to play. The moment the tape clicked on, Jasmine's breath caught, not because of what was said, but because of what wasn't. The recording began with static, then hushed voices, male, Texan accent, calm, calculated. She leaned forward slightly, straining to listen as phrases emerged from the grainy audio. "Move them after midnight. No documentation. Call it emergency relocation protocol." Every syllable landed like a blow to the chest. There was no emotion in their voices, no hesitation, just policy, packaged in cruelty. She glanced around the room. No one reacted. No eyebrows raised, no gasps. As if they'd all heard this before. As if this wasn't a scandal, it was procedure. Jasmine's hand twitched under the table, itching to reach for her phone, to record what was clearly a smoking gun. But her phone was gone. Security had taken it at the checkpoint. Routine clearance, they'd said. She'd brushed it off then. Now she understood. This wasn't a briefing. It was a setup. The room had no cameras, no press, not even a stenographer. Just 4 walls, 6 shadowed faces, and one governor smiling like the devil in denim. "Do you recognize the voices, Congresswoman?" Abbott asked, his tone laced with faux curiosity. Jasmine met his gaze, her voice low but firm. "What I recognize is conspiracy and cowardice." The woman in the medical badge flinched, but said nothing. Outside the window, the sun had climbed just high enough to cast long, sharp shadows across the floor, dividing the room like a warning. Jasmine pushed her chair back slightly, keeping her posture composed, but her eyes scanned every corner. No visible wires, no intercom, just that damn digital clock on the wall, ticking down to something no one had explained. 4712, 4711. What were they counting toward, or away from? Abbott took a sip from his glass. Ice barely melted. That's how cold this room was. "You know, Jasmine," he said softly, "I admire your fire. But fire without direction, it just burns everything around it." His smile widened. "Even the truth." Jasmine clenched her jaw. She had seen injustice before, stood in courtrooms where poor black families were evicted with forged notices, watched corporations bulldoze communities in the name of redevelopment. But this wasn't bulldozers or evictions. This was disappearance, sanctioned, systematic erasure of human beings. Children, most likely. Her voice steadied, even as her pulse roared in her ears. "You think the absence of press means the absence of consequences. You're wrong." Abbott chuckled, low and dry. "No, Congresswoman. I think the absence of power makes people desperate enough to pretend the rules still matter." The room was quiet again. Too quiet. She stood up slowly, letting the chair's legs scrape against the polished floor like a deliberate threat. "Let the record show," she said clearly, "that I do not consent to this proceeding, and I will be making this meeting public." The man nearest the door shifted, reaching inside his coat. Security or something worse, she couldn't tell. But she didn't flinch. That she had learned a long time ago. When they can't out-argue you, they try to unnerve you. When they can't unnerve you, they try to erase you. But Jasmine Crockett didn't vanish. She amplified. The tape stopped as abruptly as it began. No closing statement, no context, just silence, and then the soft whir of the clock continuing its countdown. 44:02, 44:01. Abbott's voice broke the silence, but this time it wasn't calm. It was sharp, measured, a line drawn in concrete. "You can leave now, Congresswoman. But know this. Whatever you think you're building, we've already poured the foundation beneath it." Jasmine turned to face him fully. "Then I'll bring a jackhammer," she said, and walked out, the weight of the room clinging to her like smoke. The hallway didn't feel any safer. If anything, it felt tighter, like the walls were listening. Jasmine's heels echoed with purpose as she moved toward the exit, but her mind was already racing. That room wasn't just off the record, it was off the rails. No briefing, no files, no oversight. Just insinuation and silence, carefully orchestrated to make her feel small. But she wasn't small. Not now, not ever. And yet, as the Capitol doors swung open and she stepped into the morning glare, something lodged itself in her gut. A truth she couldn't see yet, but could already feel, like a gun cocked just out of frame. By the time she reached her office, Marcus was already waiting, eyes wide, coffee untouched. "You weren't supposed to go alone," he blurted. Jasmine held up a hand. "I needed to see who'd blink first." She tossed her coat aside and walked to the desk, pulling up the encrypted drive they'd been sent weeks ago, the one with partial border transport logs. It was incomplete. At the time, they dismissed it as sloppy whistleblower data, but now it felt deliberate. The buses listed had timestamps, driver codes, destination tags, but no passenger names. Nothing. Like the cargo was invisible. Like it wasn't cargo at all. It was people being erased in plain sight. "Marcus," she said slowly, "pull every file Texas submitted to the federal grants database in the last 9 months. I want a side-by-side comparison." Now. He didn't ask why. He knew. If Greg Abbott had walked into that room with the calm of a man holding secrets, then those secrets were embedded in the system, not just policy, but process. She scrolled through line items that looked routine: cross-county transport, medical triage contract, logistics oversight services, all above board, all coded in government-neutral language. But Jasmine had been a public defender. She knew what a lie looked like when it was wearing a suit. One entry stopped her cold. Line 37C, Behavioral Relocation Initiative, $6.2 million. No vendor ID, no attached report, no audit trail. "What the hell is a behavioral relocation initiative?" she whispered. Marcus leaned in, squinting. "That's not even a DHS term. I've never seen it in federal or state classifications." She stared at the phrase, suddenly remembering Abbott's smug parting words. "We've already poured the foundation." That wasn't metaphor. That was infrastructure. Physical, funded, hidden under language so sterile it passed right through oversight like water through mesh. Jasmine stood up. "We need someone inside the grant review office. Quietly. I want access to every invoice tied to that term." Marcus hesitated. "That's classified territory. We'll need a cover." She narrowed her eyes. "Then we'll build one." Her voice dropped. "They're not just hiding people, Marcus. They're hiding how they're hiding them." Outside her window, the Capitol looked unchanged. Stone, sky, symmetry. But inside, something fundamental had cracked. This wasn't about negligence anymore. It was about design. Someone had built a machine, piece by piece, to relocate, remove, and redact human lives from the record. Not one person, not one mistake. A system, a network. And she had just stepped into the engine room. Her fingers hovered over her phone, tempted to call a journalist, to blow it open. But instinct stopped her. If she moved too soon, they'd bury it again. Deeper this time. Instead, she reached for the red notebook she kept for war room notes. She wrote down one sentence: "Find the name behind the numbers." Then she underlined it 3 times. Greg Abbott wanted her to chase shadows, but Jasmine Crockett didn't chase shadows. She hunted the light source. But numbers alone couldn't explain what Jasmine had already felt in her bones. This wasn't just paperwork fraud or budget manipulation. It was flesh and blood, stolen futures. She had seen it once, months ago, before any folder, before any subcommittee hearing. A boy, silent, small, forgotten. And ever since that moment, something inside her had refused to let it go. It happened during a tour of a privately run migrant holding center in El Paso. Jasmine had joined the trip reluctantly, invited by a humanitarian watchdog group that warned of concerning patterns in undocumented youth processing. At first glance, the facility looked orderly. Too orderly. Corridors bleached to unnatural whiteness. Staff wearing forced smiles, guiding Congress members like docents in a museum. But then she saw him. Thin arms wrapped around his knees, sitting on the edge of a cot in the far left corner of the boy's wing. He didn't look up when they passed. Didn't blink, just stared at the concrete floor like it might open and swallow him whole. No name tag. No intake form on his door. When Jasmine paused and pointed, the staffer's expression froze for a half-second too long. She turned. "What's his name?" The staffer stumbled. "He's, recent intake. No documents yet." "Where's his bracelet?" Jasmine asked, referring to the ID bands every minor was required to wear. "He's not logged in the system yet. Probably a mistake," the man replied too quickly. That was the moment she knew. There are 2 kinds of lies in the world. Those told to cover mistakes, and those told to hide crimes. This was the latter. She knelt down in front of the boy, carefully, like approaching a wounded animal. "Do you speak Spanish?" she asked gently. He didn't answer, didn't move. His eyes were sunken, his lips dry, cracked. But when she reached into her pocket and offered her unopened water bottle, his fingers twitched. Then slowly he took it. That was all. No words, no name, just a thirst that had been ignored for far too long. Later that night, Jasmine requested his file. DHS said they had no record of any boy matching his description transferred that week. ICE said he wasn't on any recent manifest. The facility swore he was in the intake pipeline, but no one could tell her where he came from or where he would be going next. And within 72 hours, when she called to follow up, she was told, "He's been relocated." Where? She demanded. Silence. Then, that's not information we can share at this time. It was the most sterile way to say he's gone. Jasmine never forgot his face, not because he looked different, but because he looked like every forgotten child history had ever buried under bureaucracy. Now back in her office, staring at line 37C Behavioral Relocation Initiative, she knew exactly what it meant. That boy was never meant to be found. Never meant to be named. The program wasn't failing. It was functioning exactly as designed. She stood slowly, her body heavy with the memory. This wasn't a policy dispute. This was human trafficking with a state seal. Marcus, she said without turning, I want every log from El Paso for the last 6 months. Staff rotations, arrival times, departure vans. I want plate numbers and timestamps. He didn't hesitate. Jasmine didn't blink. Some people came to Congress to make law. Jasmine Crockett came to tear down the ones that protected predators in suits. She knew now that the real question wasn't where the boy had gone. The real question was, how many more never even got that far? The memory of that nameless boy wasn't a scar, it was a fuse. And somewhere deep in the machine that made him disappear, Jasmine knew there had to be someone holding a match. What she didn't expect was that the match would arrive in the form of a brown envelope, unmarked, unrequested, and waiting on her desk the next morning like it had always belonged there. Marcus found it first. No postage, no courier label. Just delivered, as if someone had walked right past security, right past every camera, and placed it there by hand. Inside was a USB drive, plain, silver, scratched. No note, no signature, just a whisper in metal. Jasmine didn't ask if it had been checked for malware. She plugged it in without flinching. What loaded on her screen was chaos dressed as order. Hundreds of transport manifests, each labeled with clinical efficiency. TX-DHS-98711C, Border Run-0423A, Manifest-Batch Delta. She opened the first. Her pulse spiked. The spreadsheet was tightly formatted, dates, driver initials, vehicle numbers. But the passenger column was blank. Every row, manifest after manifest, listed dozens of departure entries with destinations like Hayu Priva Holding or EPR&DR facility. But nowhere did it say who was being moved. No names, no counts, just codes. Jasmine scrolled faster. April, March, February. Nothing. It wasn't a file dump. It was a deliberate omission, a system set up to report just enough to look compliant, but not enough to be accountable. This isn't incompetence, she murmured. This is design. Then she found it. One file buried deep, titled Zeta/Private-Redacted Distribution Matrix. Her cursor hovered before clicking. The screen blinked, and there it was. A map, digital, color-coded, overlaid with pins marking transfer corridors across Texas. Most led to temporary shelters and youth centers, but 5 of them didn't. They ended in warehouses, industrial zones, abandoned precincts converted for private processing. She zoomed in on one marked Arenda South lot. It was registered to a logistics firm she'd never heard of, Caldwell Supply Chain Solutions, LLC. Her gut turned. That's not a shelter, she whispered. That's a black site with a budget code. Marcus leaned over, face pale. We checked this company before. They're not in the contractor registry. They're ghost level. Jasmine's voice dropped into something cold and focused. Then find out who signs their checks. Because someone, somewhere, was laundering these routes through shell vendors and empty P.O. boxes, and someone was letting them do it without consequence. As she scrolled further, another pattern emerged. All special routing transfers originated from just 3 border intake centers, El Paso, Laredo, and Del Rio. And every one of them listed their dispatch under a single heading, OP Lone Star Category Beta. Lone Star, Abbott's pride and joy, the self-declared Texas solution to border chaos. It wasn't just a program, it was a cover operation, hiding an alternate network of undocumented removals inside state authority. And this email, it was the first breadcrumb dropped by someone inside. someone who either regretted their silence or feared being next. Jasmine closed the files, pulled the USB from the drive, and locked it in the reinforced drawer under her desk. She didn't speak for a full minute, then finally, "We're not looking at a scandal. We're looking at a system." Marcus nodded slowly. "So what now?" Jasmine turned to him, eyes sharp. "Now we figure out which part of the system still has a conscience." And yet, for all the fire building behind her eyes, Jasmine didn't speak. Not to the press, not to her colleagues, not even on the House floor. When power hides its crimes behind polite silence, sometimes the most dangerous weapon is refusing to break it on their terms. 3 days passed. The media swirled with half-formed theories, rumors of missing children, of ghost contractors, of state-funded removals with no oversight. Still, Jasmine said nothing. Not when a news anchor accused her of grandstanding for the cameras. Not when pundits mocked her silence as proof of weakness. She didn't flinch. She didn't tweet. She simply waited. Because what the world didn't know was that while they were chasing sound bites, she was chasing a pattern, and it was starting to breathe. In the shadows of Capitol Hill, she was mapping every contract, every code, every missing name like a detective reconstructing a crime scene in reverse. Abbott's camp, meanwhile, doubled down. His spokesperson dismissed conspiracy rumors and claimed Jasmine had fabricated whistleblower files to further a racial grievance agenda. The smear was calculated, racism dressed in bureaucracy, and it landed right on cue. On the fourth day, Jasmine walked into a closed-door oversight prep meeting and handed Marcus a folder with only one page inside. "Leak it," she said. "Quietly, let them run with it." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "This is just a vendor list with half-redacted names." "Exactly," Jasmine said. "Let them assume it's all we've got." And within hours, they did. Right-wing blogs jumped on the list, calling it incomplete, inconclusive, desperate. Fox News ran a panel claiming it proved Jasmine was reckless with national security data. And in response, she gave them nothing. No rebuttal, no outrage, just stillness. Because the louder they screamed, the more they revealed who was really afraid. Behind the scenes, however, Jasmine was assembling something far more dangerous than outrage. A timeline. The USB files were only the start. Now she had FOIA requests filed in 3 states, back-channel analysts building cross-indexes of bus license plates, and 2 former federal auditors checking for laundering paths through minor municipal contracts. It was slow, tedious, soul-draining work. And yet every redacted invoice she uncovered told the same quiet story. Money moving faster than children could be tracked, names replaced with numbers, and everything filtered through Abbott's Lone Star program like it was state-sponsored fog. What terrified Jasmine most wasn't the scale, it was the simplicity. They didn't hide it well because they never thought anyone would look. That night as she walked out of her office, a staffer stopped her in the hallway. "Are you okay?" they asked softly. Jasmine turned, her eyes tired but unwavering. "No," she said, "but I'm more dangerous when I'm quiet." She didn't look back, didn't need to. Somewhere deep in the Capitol, beneath the noise and denial and strategy meetings, there was a reckoning beginning to hum. The kind you can't televise. The kind that grows in silence until it becomes a scream no one can mute. And just as the silence began to crack, someone tried to weaponize her voice against her. A clipped, misleading soundbite from an old rally speech, 5 seconds long, edited for venom, began to circulate like wildfire across conservative media. In the video, Jasmine referred to Abbott as Governor Hot Wheels, a name she never used, a line she never delivered in that tone. The original recording, 30 minutes long and focused entirely on border policy corruption, had been chopped, twisted, and recontextualized to paint her as cruel and ableist. Overnight, she went from silent threat to public villain in headlines. Crockett mocks disabled governor. The tactic was obvious. Frame the black congresswoman as angry, frame the truth as cruelty, and worst of all, make her defense seem like guilt. Jasmine didn't blink. She released the full, unedited footage online with no caption, no commentary, just raw context. In it, she was measured, calm, speaking not about Abbott's disability, but about his deliberate misuse of state funds to create what she called a shadow deportation network built on silence, fear, and bodies that don't make it into the official count. But the damage had already been seeded. Talk show hosts clutched their pearls. Abbott's team staged a press conference where he gave a carefully choreographed performance of wounded outrage, complete with rehearsed pauses and a trembling voice. "This is what the radical left thinks of Texans with disabilities," he said, eyes glassy but calculated. "But I will not be intimidated." The press swallowed it whole. The narrative had been flipped. The man accused of trafficking children was now the victim. But Jasmine knew how political theater worked. They always went for the woman's tone before her facts. They always cried foul when their own playbook was used against them. What they didn't expect was what she dropped next. At 6:01 a.m. and with no warning, she posted a still image from an internal memo. Real, dated, and stamped confidential. The headline read, "Behavioral Relocation Units. Phase 2 Expansion. Authorization pending." Below it was Greg Abbott's digital signature. The caption? Just 4 words. "We're not done yet." Twitter exploded. News anchors scrambled. Abbott's team released 3 contradictory statements in 12 hours. And through it all, Jasmine said nothing. Because now she understood. Every time they tried to smear her, they handed her another microphone. That same evening, Jasmine walked into her office where Marcus had assembled a list of redacted contracts matching the behavioral relocation terminology. There were too many, too clean. Every page a surgical removal of accountability. She held one up to the light, half joking, half exhausted. "This is what corruption looks like when it wears a 3-piece suit." Marcus gave a dry smile. "Abbott's press team is calling you a race-baiting extremist on every network tonight." She leaned back in her chair. "Good," she said. "That means they're sweating." Then her expression hardened. "Let them keep spinning. I'm building a wire of my own." Because Jasmine wasn't just waiting to be vindicated. She was setting the stage. Every lie they threw at her gave her an opportunity to show the audience where the real violence lived. Not in words, but in systems. Not in headlines, but in housing records, missing child logs, ghost buses with sealed windows and no seatbelts. Abbott had tried to burn her with her own voice. But he forgot. Jasmine Crockett was forged in fire, and she wasn't done turning up the heat. But while Abbott's team fumbled with headlines and damage control, Jasmine was holding something far more dangerous than a rebuttal. Proof. It arrived like everything else in this case, unannounced, unsettling, and wrapped in silence. A courier dropped it off at the Capitol mailroom under a fake name. No return address. A single red folder, hand-delivered. Inside, 21 pages that didn't scream. They whispered. Whispered in codes, in line items, in signatures that weren't supposed to be visible. And at the bottom of the first page, Caldwell Supply Chain Solutions. Tier 2 state vendor authorization. Her hands trembled, not from fear, but from recognition. She had seen the name Caldwell buried in the logistics metadata from the USB drive. The company tied to warehouse stops, not shelters. And now in her hands was the contract that tied it directly to the governor's office. It wasn't just signed, it was fast-tracked through emergency procurement protocol. No bid, no review, no oversight. The attached memo read, "Expedited approval requested for behavioral transport services. Vendor has proven adaptable to variable conditions. Ideal for high-sensitivity routes." Jasmine's jaw locked. Adaptable to variable conditions was political speak for they don't ask questions. She flipped to the next page. Transportation invoices for 3 routes originating in El Paso, ending in undisclosed holdings. Total $784,000, paid in full. Then came the name, buried deep in a subcontractor column, signed with casual indifference. Miles Drennan, a familiar donor to Abbott's political war chest. Jasmine's stomach turned. She remembered that name from a fundraiser list 2 years ago. Abbott had called him the kind of man Texas was built on. Now that same man was profiting off the forced relocation of undocumented children using a shell company and invisible ink. She slammed the folder shut, then reopened it as if the papers might rearrange into something more human. They didn't. They stayed cold, factual, and brutal. Marcus, she called, voice sharp. Find me every public appearance Abbott's made in the last 8 months where Drennan was within 10 feet. She wasn't chasing rumors anymore. She was following signatures, footsteps, handshakes that cost lives. The red folder was more than evidence. It was a confession. One that had been hidden not in shadows but in plain daylight under layers of bureaucracy. Every sheet screamed the same thing. You were never supposed to look here. But Jasmine had looked, and she was still looking. She paced the room, reading every word aloud to herself like an incantation against forgetting. No one can claim ignorance after this, she muttered. Not if they see it, not if I show them. But showing meant risk. It meant fire. The kind that didn't just singe reputations, it burned careers to ash. She knew the moment she released this folder, Abbott would retaliate with everything he had, media allies, political connections, maybe even legal threats. But Jasmine Crockett didn't play defense. She circled the 3 most damning documents, scanned them, and encrypted the files to a secure drive. Then she picked up her phone and dialed a journalist she trusted with her life. Check your inbox in 15 minutes, she said, but don't open it until you're ready to understand just how deep this goes. Because sometimes the truth doesn't shout, it bleeds, quietly, line by line, page by page, and Jasmine was done bleeding alone. The moment she hung up the phone, the air in her office changed. It wasn't fear. It wasn't relief. It was pressure, like standing beneath a dam that had just started to crack. Jasmine knew the leak she had just triggered couldn't be undone. But that wasn't the point. She didn't want it undone. She wanted it to flood everything. Because when a system protects predators with policies and polished press releases, sometimes the only moral act left is to tear it apart with your bare hands. She cleared her desk with the sweep of one arm, papers, coffee cups, schedules flying like debris in a hurricane. Then she pulled out the whiteboard and began mapping it all. Names, shell companies, ghost vendors, document numbers, and one name in red at the center, Greg Abbott. Marcus entered with 2 USB drives, 3 folders, and eyes that said we're past the point of safety now. We got cross-confirmation, he said. Same company, Caldwell, is listed under a different alias in Arizona. Same bank, same routing number. Jasmine turned slowly. This isn't just Texas. It's not, Marcus said, but it started here, and so do we. By nightfall, Jasmine's office looked more like a war room than a congressional workspace. Screens glowed with heat maps of transport routes. Documents were taped to walls in constellation patterns. Her laptop buzzed every 15 minutes with alerts from whistleblower forums, encrypted email inboxes, and independent analysts feeding her every matching file they could scrape. A pattern was forming, clean on the surface, surgical underneath. Children listed as unregistered minors moved through corridors labeled behavioral intake and offloaded to unregulated facilities with no case files, no court appearances, no next of kin paperwork. Disappeared, not deported, not even trafficked, just erased. Jasmine leaned over a cluster of printouts and pointed at 3 lines that kept repeating, BRI code 2877. Transfer type, high response. Authorization, Governor Tier. Her voice was low and lethal. He signed it, personally. That means criminal liability, not just political fallout. Marcus stepped back, the weight of the words settling into the room. What's our move? Jasmine didn't hesitate. Congressional emergency probe. But first, we bait him into denying what we know is real. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, drafting a formal inquiry to the House Oversight Chair. But it wasn't just about procedure. It was about exposure. She wasn't building a case. She was lighting a fuse. At 11:17 p.m., she finally sat down, only to rise again seconds later. Something in her wouldn't let her rest. She opened a voice recorder and began dictating her own account, time-stamping every page she referenced, every name she'd seen, every child not logged in a system. It wasn't for the news, it was for history. Because if this thing swallowed her, and she knew it might, someone had to know what she saw. She ended the recording with one sentence. If the truth dies in silence, then I'll scream until they bury me with it. She saved the file under one word, strike. And as she backed up her files onto an encrypted drive, locked it in a safe behind her office bookshelf, and stared at the Capitol dome through the midnight glass, Jasmine didn't feel heroic. She felt cold, focused, prepared. Because tomorrow wasn't about protest. Tomorrow was an ambush. And she wasn't walking into that hearing with questions. She was walking in with evidence and the calm certainty that someone, somewhere, was about to lose everything they thought they had buried. She had barely slept. There was no time, no margin for rest, only countdowns. And now, as the sun cracked over Capitol Hill, Jasmine stood in a locked meeting room under low light, face unreadable, hands steady. Today wasn't about politics. It wasn't even about Abbott. It was about truth, and whether it could still survive a system designed to crush it. She had evidence. She had names. But what she needed now was something more human, something that couldn't be redacted. And that's when the door opened, slowly, hesitantly, and in stepped the woman whose silence had once kept the machine running, but who had finally decided to speak. Her name was Elena Morrow, 42, former data analyst at the Texas Department of Emergency Operations. Jasmine had never met her before, but the woman's posture said everything. Shoulders hunched like she'd carried years of secrets, eyes darting to exits, flinching at every click of a camera shutter, even though there were none in this room. She clutched a plain manila folder against her chest as if it were oxygen. Jasmine didn't greet her with a handshake. She just nodded and said softly, "You're safe here, and if you're ready, I'm listening." Elena sat, and for a moment, there was only silence. Then she spoke. Not with drama, not with fire, but with the flat voice of someone who had seen too much for too long. "I approved invoices," she said. "Thousands, every week. Most were legit. But last year something changed. New codes started showing up. Contracts I wasn't allowed to see in full. Routing sheets with names removed. Just initials. At first I thought it was data security. Then I saw one document labeled "Zero Paper Children Transfers." And I froze. Jasmine leaned in, every muscle coiled. Elena flipped open the folder, revealing a single printed email thread. It was between state officials and private contractors, discussing how to expedite juvenile movements without generating flaggable audit trails. One line stood out, underlined in pen. "No court order needed if processed under beta loan protocol." That protocol, Elena said, voice shaking now, was used for high-risk assets and state disasters, chemical leaks, floods, medical quarantines. Not children, never children. I asked my supervisor. He told me to stop asking questions. Said the governor's office had cleared it directly. Her eyes welled, but no tears fell. I kept quiet, for months, until I saw my own niece's name show up on a misfiled intake log. She was 9, had never left the state, and yet her initials were processed through a Caldwell-linked transport tag. I called her mom. She was safe. She was home. But her name had been used to fill a seat that didn't exist. Jasmine exhaled slowly, her fists clenched under the table. "You're saying they're fabricating passenger names?" Elena nodded. "Yes, or worse, replacing them." She reached into her bag and handed Jasmine a flash drive. "These are the ones I saved. From the inside. I don't know how many made it through, but if you cross them with the roots you have, I think you'll find something horrifying." Jasmine didn't blink. "You just gave us the blueprint." Elena looked away, or the burial map. And for the first time in days, Jasmine felt something shift. Not relief, not triumph, but gravity. As if the truth had finally stepped into the room, wearing a name, holding proof, and asking not to be believed, but to be used. She slid the drive into her coat pocket, stood, and offered Elena her hand. Not as a politician, but as a woman who understood what it meant to risk everything in the face of power. Because what had started as silence had just become testimony. And now, with a whistleblower's voice etched into the record and a flash drive full of ghosts waiting to be resurrected, Jasmine knew the moment had come to bring the man behind it all into the light. Not behind podiums, not at staged press conferences, but under oath, under glare, under pressure. Greg Abbott was about to take the stand, and this time, the cameras would not be kind. The chamber was electric before he even entered. Packed rows of press, aides, and staffers buzzed like a hive on edge. Some were hoping for a clash, others a collapse. But Jasmine sat stone still at the front of the subcommittee panel, her notes closed, her eyes fixed on the door. Then it opened. He entered, flanked by two legal advisors, rolling smoothly in his custom chair like a general arriving for a war he believed he'd already won. His smile was practiced, his tie perfect, his lapel pin gleaming beneath the lights. But Jasmine noticed the slight delay before he met her eyes. Not fear, calculation. The chair pounded the gavel. Proceedings began. Formalities were exchanged like thin armor. Pleasantries, cloaking tension sharp enough to slice through the oxygen. Abbott's opening statement was everything Jasmine expected. Polished, rehearsed, dripping with plausible deniability. The Lone Star program has been a cornerstone of Texas's public safety mission, he said. Any implication that we've engaged in misconduct is not only inaccurate, it's insulting. His tone was righteous, his gaze steady, but Jasmine didn't flinch. When it was her turn, she didn't raise her voice. She didn't lean forward. She simply adjusted the microphone, locked her eyes on his, and said, "Let's begin with the term behavioral relocation initiative. Can you define it for the record?" Abbott blinked, just once. "That's not a term I'm familiar with in operational use." Jasmine clicked her pen once. "Interesting, because I have 6 invoices signed by your office approving line items under that exact title, including one dated March 17th of this year." She slid the red folder across the table. The room held its breath. Abbott didn't touch it. "I signed hundreds of documents. I don't recall each line item." Jasmine nodded slowly. "So if children were being moved under false transport codes and sent to private facilities with no audit trail, you're saying that happened without your knowledge?" Silence, then. "I'm saying your characterization is inflammatory and speculative." Jasmine leaned in slightly now, not as an attack, but as a declaration. "No, Governor. What's inflammatory is a government that funds black site transfers and calls it child protection. What's speculative is a system that loses track of minors and finds ways to bill taxpayers for the disappearance." Murmurs rippled through the gallery. Abbott adjusted his tie. "Congresswoman, I'm here in good faith." "Are you?" she interrupted. "Because good faith doesn't erase names. Good faith doesn't build warehouse stops into bus routes. Good faith doesn't bury paper trails under Tier 2 authorization." His attorneys shifted uncomfortably. One whispered into his ear. He didn't respond. For the first time, the lines on his face tightened, not with anger, but with restraint. Jasmine pressed on. "Final question, for now. Can you confirm or deny that your campaign received direct donations from Miles Drennan in the same month Caldwell Supply Chain Solutions was awarded their emergency contract?" Abbott hesitated, then flatly, "I'll refer that question to counsel." Jasmine leaned back. "Noted. For the record, silence is also a statement." And just like that, the room exhaled, louder now, restless, buzzing with headlines that were already writing themselves. Jasmine didn't gloat. She didn't even look at him again. She simply turned her head, gave a subtle nod to Marcus in the back row, and waited. Because the governor had taken the stand, but the truth hadn't yet. That would come next. But Abbott's refusal to answer wasn't the end. It was the trigger. Jasmine had known the moment would come, the point where his denials would run out of script, and the silence would become a confession of its own. And now, as the murmurs died and the cameras refocused, she reached under the table and pulled out the final blow. Not a speech, not a headline, but a voice. "I'd like to enter one more piece of evidence into the record," she said calmly. Her hand slid a flash drive across the polished surface. "This audio file was submitted by a verified former state contractor. It contains a recorded planning session between senior Lone Star officials and private logistics executives." The chair nodded. The text moved. The room dimmed just slightly as the playback was cued. And then, the voices. Clear, confident, unconcerned. "We can push 2 more runs before audit week. Use category beta. No IDs required on child manifests." Another voice responded, "Make sure the names align with DHS leftovers." Nothing traceable. As long as the optics stay clean, the governor stays clean. You could have heard a pin drop. Abbott's face didn't move, but his eyes narrowed. His lawyer shifted in his seat, blinking fast. The voice continued. We're not losing kids, we're moving obstacles. Unpapered minors slow the system. This speeds it up. The words hit the air like gunshots. Jasmine didn't look away. She didn't need to. The entire room was frozen, and the sound wasn't just exposing corruption, it was indicting the very machinery that allowed it to exist. Then the final line. Governor's office is greenlighting this as mission critical. He's briefed. He wants deniability, not distance. When the audio cut off, no one breathed. Not the aides, not the reporters, not even the opposition members who had once defended Lone Star as essential border enforcement. The silence wasn't empty. It was charged. Like the split second before thunder levels the sky, Jasmine leaned into her mic. That recording has been authenticated by a third-party forensic team and time-stamped. It aligns with known contract dates and facility transfers. Any questions? The chair didn't answer. No one did. Even Abbott sat stiff, eyes locked on the desk in front of him, jaw clenched so hard it seemed wired shut. Jasmine scanned the room. This is what happens, she said slowly, when power stops fearing consequences, when bureaucracy becomes a cover for harm, when the vulnerable are turned into logistical liabilities. She paused. And when those responsible think no one's watching. Her voice didn't rise, but it didn't need to. The silence made her louder. She turned to Abbott one last time. I asked you earlier what behavioral relocation meant. You said you didn't know. She tapped the mic. Now we all do. The gavel didn't fall. No one called for order, because order had been shattered. What remained was the echo of a truth too precise to be denied, too damning to be dismissed, a truth that couldn't be unspoken. Abbott remained still, his expression unreadable. But his empire had just been pierced, not by a scream, but by a tape, by planning, by quiet voices in dark rooms caught speaking too plainly. And Jasmine? She didn't smile. She didn't celebrate. She simply closed her folder and stood. Because in a chamber full of noise, the loudest weapon she had was silence, and she had just used it to burn the room down. The chamber had gone quiet, but the war wasn't over. Jasmine knew that exposing the machine wasn't enough. Numbers didn't cry, documents didn't bleed, and somewhere buried beneath code names and sanitized invoices were real children, children who remembered everything. What came next wasn't about the system, it was about the survivors. And one of them had finally been found. Her name was Elena, not the analyst. A child, 11 years old, Honduran by birth, Texan by circumstance, missing for 7 weeks before being miraculously located by a migrant advocacy group in New Mexico. She had been listed in the redacted files as EC, transfer cleared, Delta route, but she wasn't supposed to be found. She wasn't supposed to make it out. And now Jasmine sat with her in a quiet room just a few blocks from Capitol Hill. No press, no cameras, just a translator and a therapist nearby in case things got too heavy. But Elena didn't cry. She didn't shake. She sat upright, feet barely touching the floor, her small hands gripping a styrofoam cup of orange juice like it was armor. Jasmine asked gently, "Do you remember the bus?" The girl nodded once. She spoke in Spanish, voice thin but steady. There were many of us. No names. They didn't let us speak. If we cried, they turned up the radio. Jasmine's chest tightened. Did you know where you were going? Elena shook her head. They said it was another shelter, but it wasn't. It was cold. No windows. No beds. Just mats. I saw a boy try to run. They tied his hands. The translator hesitated, then looked at Jasmine. She says the boy never came back after that night. Jasmine's jaw clenched. How long were you there? The girl answered without pause. Too long for a child to forget. Jasmine pulled a tablet from her bag and opened the encrypted file with the transport manifest. She scrolled to the code. TX-Delta-773. Was this the bus number? Elena leaned forward, her eyes scanning the screen. Then, slowly, she reached out and pointed. Yes, that one. Jasmine felt something inside her fracture and harden all at once. There it was, confirmation, straight from a child's mouth. Not theory, not leaked data, testimony. A voice plucked from a spreadsheet and placed back into humanity. Elena looked up. They called us ghosts. Said no one was looking. That's why they moved us at night. Jasmine bit the inside of her cheek to keep her composure. But someone was looking, she said softly. Me. When the session ended, Jasmine didn't go back to her office. She walked to the reflecting pool outside the Capitol and stared at the water, her reflection fractured by the wind. Marcus joined her minutes later. You good? He asked. She shook her head. That little girl, she's braver than every man in that chamber. He didn't disagree. Are you going to bring her to testify? Jasmine turned, eyes like stone. Only if she wants to. But her story, that's already in motion. And I swear to God, the whole country's going to hear it, whether they're ready or not. Because you can bury files, you can shred paper, you can spin headlines and weaponize silence. But once a child speaks, once a name reclaims itself from the dark, there's no system strong enough to shut it down. Jasmine had promised Elena a choice, but the girl didn't hesitate. When asked if she wanted to tell her story in front of Congress, she looked Jasmine dead in the eye and said, they need to know what they did. No fear, no drama, just clarity. Jasmine nodded, swallowing a wave of something between pride and heartbreak. So when the day arrived, the girl didn't walk into that chamber alone. She walked in with truth at her back, in the eyes of the nation waiting for her to speak. The chamber was at capacity. Reporters, Congress members, staffers, and more cameras than Jasmine had ever seen in her life. Every major network was live. Security was tight. The tension, tighter. Abbott was present again, seated to the side, his expression blank but visibly clenched. When Elena took her seat at the witness table, feet dangling, hands folded in her lap, there was an audible hush, the kind reserved for moments no one wants to miss. Jasmine sat just a few feet away, jaw tight, hands folded, ready to burn down the building if one more adult tried to dismiss this child's voice. The chair asked for her name. She spoke into the microphone with perfect posture. Elena Cruz, do you understand why you're here today? Yes, she said. To tell the truth, because the papers didn't. The room stiffened. Jasmine bit her lip to stay composed. Elena began her account of the bus, the warehouse, the night they took her shoes, the girl who wouldn't stop crying, and the man who said, they won't remember you if they never saw you. Her words were steady, chilling. She didn't cry, but others did. By the time she described how the lights were kept off for discipline, even the stenographer's fingers hesitated. But power never concedes quietly. And while the country lit candles and raised fists, Greg Abbott was already writing his next move in the dark. Jasmine had expected retaliation, but even she didn't predict how far he'd go. 2 nights after Elena's testimony shattered the nation's conscience, Abbott emerged from silence with a primetime interview on national television. No press pool, no unscripted questions, just him, a sympathetic anchor, and a tightly rehearsed narrative built to reframe the fire as fiction. The lights were warm, his voice softer than usual. He began with a sigh, the kind that signals burden, not guilt. I've been quiet, he said, because I didn't want to politicize pain. But I can't let lies stand unanswered. Then came the knife wrapped in silk. This child, Elena, she's been used. Used by those who seek to divide us. I've never authorized secret transfers. I've never approved anything called behavioral relocation. These are attacks, not facts. This is performance politics. He leaned forward. I'm a man in a wheelchair, trying to protect his state, and they're trying to roll over me with hysteria. The word echoed. Hysteria, deliberate, calculated, aimed not just at Jasmine, but at every woman who'd ever raised her voice and been told it was too sharp. Jasmine watched the broadcast in silence, her face blank but her mind racing. She knew the move. Frame the truth as manipulation. Frame the child as confused. Frame the black congresswoman as angry and dangerous. And most of all, frame himself as the victim. Abbott wasn't defending himself. He was building an exit ramp for the country to look away. And the terrifying thing? It was working. Within hours, right-wing media had their talking point. The little girl was coached. "This is another hoax. Where's the proof?" Jasmine wanted to scream, but she didn't. Screaming was their expectation. She had a better weapon. The next morning, Jasmine released the forensic timeline. Every bus route, every invoice, every timestamp from the flash drive cross-referenced with cell tower pings, GPS logs, and facility entry records. She didn't announce it with drama. Just a tweet. "No need to believe me. Believe the math." And for those who looked closely, the math was damning. It proved the roots existed. It proved the times lined up with Elena's testimony. And it proved that Abbott's denials were built on gaps in memory that had already been filled. Still, the smear machine moved fast. Anonymous voices began leaking doctored footage of Jasmine at past rallies, out-of-context clips, yelled sound bites with the context ripped clean away. A headline read, "Crockett's History of Anti-Texas Rhetoric." Another, "Too radical to lead, too reckless to listen." And beneath it all, the quiet message. "Don't believe the black woman. Believe the man with the tie." Jasmine met with her team that night, her face illuminated by firestorm headlines. "They're not trying to clear their name," she said. "They're trying to bury mine." Marcus asked, "So what now?" Her reply was immediate. "We don't outshout them. We outlast them." Because Jasmine Crockett didn't need to win the news cycle. She was playing for the legacy. And Abbott had just tried to turn the truth into a public relations war. But Jasmine wasn't playing chess. She was pulling the board off the table and building something they couldn't spin. Abbott had made his countermove. The headlines were loud, the smear campaign louder. But Jasmine knew something he didn't. Sometimes the loudest blows landed in silence. And so, when the invitation came for both of them to appear on a nationally televised bipartisan panel, Jasmine didn't hesitate. She didn't ask for prep. She didn't call a strategist. She simply said yes. Because the battlefield had shifted. The war wasn't in back rooms anymore. It was in living rooms. And now the nation would see who stood behind spin and who stood behind the truth. The set was minimalist. Neutral tones, 2 chairs under soft lighting, one reserved for Jasmine, the other for Abbott. No podiums, no distractions. Just 2 people, 2 microphones, and an audience of millions. Abbott rolled in first, composed, affable, wearing the calm of a man who believed optics were everything. Jasmine followed, expression unreadable, dressed in muted gray with no accessories. Her armor wasn't fabric, it was fact. When the moderator welcomed them and opened with pleasantries, neither flinched. But the temperature in the room dropped the second the first real question landed. "Congresswoman Crockett," the host asked, "do you truly believe the governor of Texas personally orchestrated a covert deportation network?" Jasmine turned, not to the moderator, but to Abbott. Her voice was calm. "I don't believe it. I've proven it." Abbott laughed quietly, shaking his head with mock sympathy. "This is what our politics has become. Accusations without evidence. Drama over data." Jasmine leaned slightly forward. "The data is public. The victims are named. And the trail leads to your desk. What you call drama, Governor, the rest of us call accountability." Abbott responded with the charm of a man who had rehearsed. "With all due respect, Congresswoman, your version of accountability is built on fear. You've terrified the public into thinking our immigration system is a monster. You've turned children into weapons." Jasmine didn't blink. "No, Governor, you did that. I gave them back their names." The room held its breath. The moderator tried to interject. Abbott cut across him, voice rising. "You're trying to dismantle state sovereignty." Jasmine's reply came like steel wrapped in velvet. "I'm trying to dismantle cruelty." The tension was surgical. 2 ideologies locked in full view, one hiding behind deflection, the other holding up a mirror. But Jasmine wasn't there to spar. She was there to end the illusion. And so she spoke not to Abbott, but to the audience. "Let me be clear. If you're more outraged by my tone than the fact that we lost track of children under government care, then you're not angry at injustice. You're angry it got caught." The words sliced through the panel like glass. Abbott shifted in his chair, jaw tight. Then the final question came. Governor Abbott, will you cooperate fully with the congressional investigation now underway? He hesitated for the first time, just long enough for everyone to notice. I've always supported transparency, he said slowly, but I won't allow witch hunts to dictate governance. Jasmine's voice cut in, soft but final. It's not a witch hunt if the bodies are real. Silence. Cold. Absolute. Not a sound in the room. The cameras zoomed in. No one dared look away, because in that moment, the performance cracked, and what remained was truth. Undeniable, uncomfortable, and unforgiving. The studio lights had dimmed, the panel had ended, but the echo of Jasmine's final words, "It's not a witch hunt if the bodies are real," still lingered across the country like gunpowder in the air. She had held the line, not with rage but with precision. But public confrontation was just a spark. The real detonation was coming next, and it wouldn't play out on a stage. It would happen where policy became power, on the floor of Congress. Jasmine didn't need applause. She needed votes, and she was about to find out just how many in Washington had the stomach to face the mirror she'd held up. The session was scheduled under urgency protocol, a rare maneuver that required cross-party consent. But no one wanted to be on record delaying a vote tied to child disappearance. Not now, not after Elena, not after the audio, not after the country had stared into the darkness and whispered, "We need to do something." Jasmine sat near the back of the chamber, surrounded by members who, days ago, wouldn't return her emails. Now they nodded respectfully, eyes lowered, not in shame, but in fear. Because if they voted no, they knew what the headlines would say by morning. Congress protects a governor again. The speaker took the floor. Cameras were rolling, phones were locked. The resolution was simple in language but thunderous in implication. Initiate formal congressional investigation into the office of the governor of Texas regarding the Behavioral Relocation Initiative and associated undocumented minor transfers. Jasmine had helped draft every word. She had fought to ensure it didn't just call for hearings, it called for subpoenas, audits, full federal oversight. She didn't just want Abbott questioned, she wanted the system dissected. The vote began. One by one, the names were called. The chamber pulsed with tension as each yay or nay landed like a verdict. Early tallies were close, too close. Jasmine didn't flinch. She kept her eyes on the board. Midway through the roll, something shifted. A Republican from Arizona, longtime ally of Abbott, paused before speaking, then said, "Yeah." A murmur, then a moderate from Georgia, then a quiet wave from the Midwest. And then, like the snap of a dam giving way, it happened. The 218th, yay. The number that turned suspicion into mandate. The floor broke into gasps, murmurs, and, somewhere in the back, an audible sob. Jasmine didn't smile. She stood only after the final tally was confirmed, 243 to 192. A bipartisan congressional probe was now a reality. Abbott was no longer just a headline. He was officially under federal investigation. As members gathered to whisper and speculate, Jasmine walked silently down the aisle, past reporters, past colleagues, past cameras that wanted her reaction. She gave them nothing, no soundbite, no gesture. Only movement. Outside the chamber, Marcus caught up to her. "You did it," he said breathlessly. Jasmine kept walking. "No," she said, "we started it." Because a vote wasn't justice, a probe wasn't reform, and children lost in systems didn't get rescued by procedures. They got rescued by persistence. And as she exited the Capitol into the chaos of reporters and camera flashes, she didn't pause to address them. She didn't need to. The institution had finally spoken. Now it would be forced to listen. The vote had been cast, the probe authorized, and for the first time, the system had been forced to name its failure out loud. But Jasmine knew better than to mistake noise for change. Investigations could stall, headlines could fade. The machine that allowed children to vanish didn't run on outrage. It ran on silence, paperwork, and loopholes so cleanly written they passed as order. So while the cameras chased statements and Twitter devoured sound bites, Jasmine was already back in her office. Pen in hand, sleeves rolled, drafting something real, something permanent, not punishment, protection. The first draft of the Unaccompanied Minors Protection and Oversight Act wasn't elegant, it wasn't polished, but it was undeniable. It created real-time national tracking for children in state custody. It mandated third-party audits for all emergency relocation protocols. It criminalized the use of undisclosed vendors in juvenile transport. And most of all, it established a permanent public access log for all state-contracted child transfers. No more fake names. No more behavioral relocation codes. No more children slipping between the cracks of power and paperwork. Jasmine read every line out loud before signing it. If they want loopholes, she whispered, they'll have to crawl through sunlight. She named the bill for someone who never asked for credit. Elena Cruz, the same girl who had sat on a national stage and ripped the curtain off an entire system with nothing but memory and courage. The preamble began not with legalese, but with a promise. This act shall serve to ensure that the name of any child moved by the American government shall never again be erased to preserve the comfort of power. She added one final clause, simple, sharp, and impossible to ignore. Every route must end with a record. As the bill circulated through co-sponsors, Jasmine refused interviews. She declined primetime debates. She wasn't chasing a viral moment. She was building a law, one that could outlive headlines, one that couldn't be erased by the next election. She met with policy analysts, immigrant advocacy groups, civil rights attorneys. She asked them not for applause, but for edits, for loopholes, for every hole they could imagine a future predator crawling through. She wanted the bill to be airtight, not popular, effective, not poetic. The work was grueling, quiet, unglamorous. But it was the only kind of justice she trusted, the kind written in ink that couldn't be washed away when the cameras left. Outside her window, protests still bloomed like wildfires. But Jasmine didn't look out. She kept her eyes on the pages in front of her, on the names of children turned into case numbers, on the legacy of a state that called cruelty a solution, and on the chance, just a chance, that the next girl wouldn't need to testify just to be seen. Because justice doesn't begin with applause. It begins with accountability, with policy, with the kind of pen that shakes when you write the truth into law. While the ink dried on a bill meant to outlive her, Jasmine knew the storm outside hadn't passed. It had only split. Because as the Unaccompanied Minors Protection and Oversight Act gathered momentum, so did the backlash. Some called it a revolution, others a betrayal. And suddenly it became clear. Jasmine wasn't just walking through history, she was walking the fault line between two Americas. One America saw Elena as a hero, a child whose voice had ripped the mask off a brutal system and forced a country to reckon with its own reflection. They showed up to town halls holding signs that read, "Protect the invisible," and "Children are not logistics." They wrote to Jasmine by the thousands, parents, teachers, pastors, even former ICE agents, thanking her for refusing to look away. But the other America? It was louder now, angrier, and it wanted blood. Death threats poured in like clockwork. One caller said, "You'll be the next one relocated." Another warned, "Texas remembers its enemies." Conservative lawmakers introduced counterbills with names like the Sovereign Border Act and the Domestic Safety Clause. Their goal was simple: confuse the narrative, dilute the truth, and paint Jasmine as the chaos. And yet she never flinched, not when her office had to be evacuated after a suspicious package was delivered. Not when a protest outside her district headquarters turned violent. Not even when her face was plastered across headlines next to the words "Un-American." Because Jasmine had always known what it meant to walk into power that wasn't built for you. She'd done it in courtrooms, in committee rooms, in neighborhoods where the government only showed up with handcuffs or budget cuts. She didn't expect grace. She expected resistance. And she had learned how to turn that resistance into fuel. Still, there were moments, late nights when the building was quiet, when the hate mail piled too high, when even Marcus went home, that the weight pressed deeper. Two Americas, one that wanted justice and one that wanted her gone. She stared out her window at the Capitol dome and whispered, "If they're this scared of a little girl's voice, imagine what would happen if every one of them spoke." That was the America she was fighting for, the one that hadn't arrived yet, but was coming, slowly, in whispers, in names reclaimed from government databases, in children who might now live their lives without having to testify just to prove they existed. Because Jasmine Crockett had never believed the lie that America was broken. She believed it had always been two different stories told at the same time, one in power, one in pain. And now finally the story in pain was being written in ink, on the floor of Congress, in the hearts of millions, and in the hands of a woman who refused to let the quiet be mistaken for defeat. The cameras were gone. The hearings had ended. The bill was on its way to the Senate, and the crowds outside the Capitol had thinned to whispers. But Jasmine Crockett remained at her desk, long after the echoes faded, staring at a list of names, some still missing, some found too late, all of them burned into her memory like scars she never asked for, but would never erase. The fight was far from over, but in this quiet, this rare, almost holy silence, she finally had time to confront the weight she'd been carrying, not just the outrage, not just the fury, but the quiet grief beneath it all. She opened a drawer and pulled out the first red folder, the original one, the one that had started it all. Pages crinkled at the edges, fingerprints still smudged into the margins, each line a quiet scream waiting to be heard. She laid it beside a picture of Elena, smiling, eyes bright, holding a stuffed bear given to her by a volunteer on her first day back in school. Two pieces of the same story, one filled with absence, the other defiant presence. Jasmine exhaled hard, then whispered to no one, "This is what justice looks like, paperwork and people." Because the truth was, no vote, no law, no speech would undo what had already been done. But it could make sure the next girl didn't need to testify just to exist. Later that evening, she returned home and stood in front of a mirror, still in her work clothes. She looked older, not tired, seasoned, hardened, but not brittle. She touched her own reflection, thinking of the little girls who would one day read her name in history books and never know the weight behind it. The death threats, the silence, the rooms full of men who smiled to her face and erased her behind closed doors. But she also thought of the fire, the fury, the faces in the crowd, the woman on the bus who whispered, "Thank you for not letting them make her disappear." Jasmine didn't need statues. She needed results. She stepped out onto her porch as night fell, city lights blinking like stars below the horizon line of power. Somewhere across the country, another child was crossing a border. Somewhere, another was being put on a bus. And somewhere, someone was still trying to make sure none of them were remembered. Jasmine didn't pretend she'd ended that darkness, but she had punctured it, and now the light was leaking in. Because in the end, we don't choose what happens to us. We only choose what we carry. Some carry fear, others, silence. But Jasmine Crockett, she carried names. She carried law. She carried every scream no one heard and every truth no one wanted written down. And as long as she carried them, the system would never be able to bury them again. In a world where systems are built to forget the most vulnerable, the greatest act of defiance is to remember and to act. Jasmine didn't set out to be a hero. She chose not to look away. And that choice, quiet, relentless, unshakable, became her power. You don't need a microphone or a title to make a difference. Sometimes all it takes is the courage to carry what others drop. So ask yourself, whose voice are you willing to carry? And what silence are you brave enough to break? Because justice doesn't begin in courtrooms. It begins in you.